Professor here at Grand Valley. Welcome to everyone who's joining us in person and online. Just to let you know, I will be introducing our speakers with their names and their paper titles, but if you're interested in their background and bio, it's on the GLHC website, and that way you don't have to, I don't have to take up their speaking time with things you can find easily. We'll be starting off with Amanda Reskus, who is joining us from Ohio State University, and she'll be giving her paper, The Meeting Place of the Merchants. Oh, and also, sorry, one more note. I'll be keeping time, so it's about 20 minutes per paper, so you should have plenty of time for questions at the end. And if you're joining us online, please put your questions in the chat on Zoom, and we will address them at the end and make sure you make a note of who your questions for. And with that, I want to hand things off to Amanda. Thank you.
You can go, Amanda, whenever you're ready.
Hi, I can't actually really hear what's happening in the room, so I'm not sure if we're starting at this point.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Well, first, I'd just like to thank Nathan and Peter and all of the members of the organizing committee, the other panelists and the student presenters who were really impressive earlier this afternoon. And I'm just going to take a second to share my slides. Okay, are you able to see my slides?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. In his 13th century ethical manual, the Akhlaq-i-Nasiri, the Persian scholar Nasruddin Tusi described home as the shelter provided by a series of relationships, as opposed to a built physical environment. He writes, "What I mean by home is not the physical house built of sun-dried bricks, dirt, wood, and stone, but rather the relationships among husband and wife, child and the person who nurtures him, be it all in a house built of wood and stone, a simple tent, or even a mere shelter in nature." Medieval Muslim merchants traveling from the coasts of the Persian Gulf and Red Sea to far-flung locations as distant as China and Southeast Asia found themselves far from the protections and supports of relationships back home for very long stretches of time. The seasonal monsoon that governed travel on the Indian Ocean dictated what time of year it was safe to sail from the western rim of the ocean's littoral to the east and back again. Sea merchants often found themselves in faraway ports for significant stretches of time, waiting for the seasonal monsoon to return and carry them home, or establishing new homes in the diaspora. The social spaces forged in port cities and created on board long-distance merchant vessels provided an alternate form of social shelter that nurtured and protected seafarers. In this talk, I would like to examine the social worlds created and navigated by Muslim seafarers in the 9th through the 14th centuries from the standpoint first of the ocean-going vessels that served as temporary homes while in transit, and the port city communities that they established on the southern coast of China. Medieval merchants who traveled across the trade routes linking the Western Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia and China left behind a record of their experiences in the form of travel narratives and physical artifacts. Shipwrecks dating from this period have been recovered in the Java and South China Seas, and their excavated cargoes, as well as the personal possessions of their crew members, provide a window into the unique social spaces on board ships. Long-distance voyages brought together merchants and seafarers from diverse locations, and life at sea and at port built a framework for social relationships and institutions that reinforced and sometimes defied the boundaries of land. But before we get into the evidence specifically of medieval social worlds on the maritime Silk Road, a little background information on the longue durée of maritime trade between the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Indian Ocean is a helpful starting point. Significant maritime contact between Iran and China reaches back to late antiquity. predating the Islamic conquest of Iran. Evidence of substantial Persian Gulf long-distance trade with China exists from as early as the 4th century CE. Scholars, including Touraj Daryai, have described fragments of 4th century Chinese trade goods that have been recovered from Iran's southern coast, and Sassanid numismatic evidence has been recovered from multiple Chinese territories, most densely concentrated along the southeastern coast. Islam was introduced to China by sea in the 7th century, and large communities of Muslim merchants developed in coastal areas. The Tang period provided enormous opportunities for long-distance trade, but also brought with it political turmoil and violence that periodically impacted the Muslim merchant community. The name for this talk, the gathering place of the merchants, comes from a Tang dynasty, or rather Abbasid period, description of the port city of Guangzhou. Port cities were not just places where business was done, but where the archaeological record reveals that Muslims increasingly put down roots. Tombs from the cities of Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Quanzhou, known as Khanfu, Kinsai, and Zaytun in Arabic sources, document a wide variety of points of origin and a long duration of migration and settlement. For Muslim merchants who stayed in China for long periods of time or remained there permanently, an increasingly large selection of local mosques and Hanukkahs or hospices helped to meet their needs for community and security. Changes in trade policies during the Song period led to the consolidation of already large resident foreign merchant communities in port cities, particularly in the late 10th century when trade was officially transferred from the level of the state to the entity of the port itself, which Derek Hung has detailed in his work. By the Yuan period, Persian had become the lingua franca of maritime trade in the Southern Ocean. And Persian Muslims with roots in China played an essential role in the spread of Islam to Southeast Asia. The infrastructure of social relationships in port cities reminds me in one sense of the Iranian earth that was carried by merchants departing the coastal ports of the Persian Gulf in the medieval period as an amulet against shipwrecks. These amulets served both as a tangible connection to home, to security, to land, but also as an expression of religious and community participation and identity. Earth taken from the gravesite of the Sufi Sheikh Kazaruni carried the powerful blessing and spiritual protection promised to devotees, and participation in the Kazaruni network of Hanukkahs or hospices around the Indian Ocean, documented by Ibn Battuta in his travel narrative and described by scholars like Ralph Kautz and John Chafee, provided community and safety. Maintaining a loose connection to home provided an open link within which to navigate life at sea. The majority of objects that have survived shipwrecks from this period are trade goods, things like ceramics, metalware, ivory, and incense. However, some materials which seem to have been personal belongings of crew members or intended primarily for their use have been recovered. Grindstones, rollers, and cookware have been recovered from multiple long-distance ships found in Southeast Asia, as well as small amounts of culinary ingredients like nipa, palm fruit, and ganlan. Game pieces and dice have been brought up from multiple shipwrecks. A die made from bone and carved ivory pieces were recovered from the 9th century Beiletung wreck, which was en route back to the Middle East from China when it wrecked. And 2 wooden dice were found in the 13th century Pulu Buaya wreckage. Crews relied on each other to pass the time and to survive. A description of whales from Book 1 of Al-Sirafi's accounts of China and India captures an interesting snapshot of the intercultural and interfaith teamwork on board merchant vessels. The tower of water that explodes from a whale's blowhole is described as a minaret, the architectural feature of mosques where the call to prayer is sounded. To frighten whales away at night, the author recounts crew members sounding nawakis, wooden clappers that were used by Christians in the Church of the East during the liturgy. The fear of death brought together multi-faith crews into pragmatic communion, but the evidence of game pieces and dice reveal a lighter side of their time spent together at sea, a place where camaraderie and friendship would have made for smoother sailing. Medieval Muslim geographers documented the international port cities on China's southern seaboard that represented the end of the long voyage from Iran. Ali Yaqubi delineated the 7 segments of the maritime journey leading from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, culminating in a landing at the major port city of Guangzhou, captured in accounts of China and India as the meeting place of the merchants. Ibn Khordadbeh described in his 9th century book of routes and provinces the successive ports of Kanfu, which was Guangzhou, Jianfu, Quanzhou, and Kantu, Yangzhou, lining the coast. During the Tang period, Guangzhou had been the primary port of settlement for Persian and Arab merchants until conditions there shifted during the late Tang and Song dynasties, and their migration transferred to Quanzhou. The port of Quanzhou was immortalized as the vibrant intercultural city of Zaytun in Ibn Battuta's famous 14th century travelogue. In Quanzhou and the other coastal ports, there developed distinctive neighborhood communities for foreign merchants, known as fanfang, each with their own designated leader. The leadership within each fanfang was responsible for seeing to the affairs of the community. Chiefs coordinated the recruitment of foreign traders from abroad and oversaw internal community affairs. According to the Pingzhou Khitan and Derek Hung's wonderful contributions on this topic, this leadership was derived from within the foreign community, but straddled a line of Chinese self-presentation, wearing the typical, quote, towel, gown, shoes, and audience tablet like those of the Chinese people. This appearance set leadership apart from the rest of the occupants of the foreign merchant quarter, whose, quote, clothes and attire are different than that of the Chinese. This difference in bodily adornment was noted as significant in matters of discipline and deportation, as caning led to increased pain amongst foreigners who, quote, did not wear trousers and prefer to sit on the ground. In these descriptions, a kind of stratification is evidenced, where those with a degree of power over their fellow foreigners are, at least partially, cynicized in their role as middle figures, exerting authority over their countrymen. For many, it seems, retaining customary dress from abroad remained important, even if it came with consequences and indicated a lower social status. The Pingzhou Khitan goes on to record additional layers of social stratification evidenced in practices of adornment within the foreign communities. Quote, their fingers are all adorned with precious stones mounted on gold and tin rings, and these distinguish the poor from the rich. There were economic disparities among the merchant class, documented through hierarchies of style and membership in subgroups based on scale and reach of merchant activities, state sponsorship, participation in large private commercial enterprises, or subsistence through small-time individual trade. Changes in imperial trade policies in the 10th and 11th centuries intensified the stratification of hierarchy in the foreign merchant community. Relationships between Muslim merchants grew more complex, and relationships with local authorities and locals, period, continued to shape power and influence. The divisions within the Muslim community in the fanfang were accompanied by a certain equalizing communitas imported from home. Destitute merchants, fallen on hard times, out of money and far from home, were presented with money orders by the Khazaruni Sufi order to be cashed out by any other merchant who made their sheikh a vow. Khazaruni merchants left Iran for destinations across the Indian Ocean world and the South China Sea, making vows to the order and taking with them dust from the gravesite of their founder. If they arrived safely at their destination in China, they paid their vows to the sheikh at the port or directly to the destitute upon presentation of the money order. The charity provided by the Khazaruni order also included lodging and meals in exchange for participation in the work of the community. According to al-Sarafi's accounts and the work of scholars like Fan, In the Tang period, the Fanfang of Guangzhou functioned with a large degree of extraterritoriality, operating under the official administration of Islamic law. Archaeological evidence of 6 distinct Middle Period mosques has been recovered in Quanzhou, with one still standing today. Where the Sufi orders provided a financial safety net in the theologically antinomian tradition of Sufism, the application of Sharia within the Fangfang made merchant expectations of legal codes coherent from place to place. It regulated social relationships. The Kazarunis provided social structure, the guarantee of spiritual and physical safety at sea, and a massive network of community for travelers who stayed in their religious lodgings spread throughout the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. Ibn Battuta described a robust community at the religious lodging when he visited Quanzhou. He wrote that the Khazaruni Sheikh Burhanuddin collected the financial pledges of merchants arriving from Western Asia, and that across the region, there is not a ship that comes from China or from India, but has thousands of dinars in it, pledged to the order. An extremely unique aspect of the Iranian Khazaruni order abroad, pointed out by Kautz, was its retained and vital connection to the central Khanaqah back home in Khazarun, which organized its operations. The Khazaruni merchant brethren of Quanzhou were linked with other more orthodox believers in shared reverence for a particular hill in the southeastern part of the city of Quanzhou. Multiple sources assert that 4 companions of the Prophet Muhammad migrated to China during the Tang Dynasty in the earliest days of Islam. 2 of these disciples, believed to be sent by Muhammad himself, were thought to be buried in the area of Quanzhou's Lingshan, where their tombs remain. This geographic proximity to his companions imbued Quanzhou with the barakat of the Prophet and collapsed the distance between the holy figures of Islam and the spatial remove of China. The Muslim community of the city stood in a direct spiritual genealogy, a kinship with Muhammad at its center, regardless of their own diverse geographic origins. The oldest mosque in China is remembered by the Chinese Muslim community as the Huaishengsi in Guangzhou, and is believed by the community to this day to have been founded by Waqas, Muhammad's companion and close direct relative. Historians do not accept this community history, word for word, but it speaks to the close and direct ties the earliest Muslim communities in China forged with each other and with Islam's origins. The Lingshan tombs in Quanzhou are among hundreds of burials of foreign immigrants across the city and countryside. An entry in the Jufanji, the record of barbarous peoples, by medieval Quanzhou port official Zhao Rugua, describes the establishment of a cemetery for foreign merchants by a Persian trader who was, quote, filled with the spirit of his Western home. Zhao writes a foreign trader by the name of Shi Na Wei, a Dashir, meaning Persian or Arab by birth, established himself in the southern suburb of Quanzhou. Disdaining wealth but charitable and filled with the spirit of his Western home, he built a charnel house in the southwestern corner of the suburb, or outside the city in the southwest direction, as the last resting place of the abandoned bodies of foreign traders. This idea of rescuing the abandoned and a responsibility borne by the Muslim community to take care of their own far from home speaks to the connections between social and religious bonds. The majority of the Islamic tombstones recovered in Quanzhou were separated from their graves and original contexts in the 14th and 15th centuries during periods of political tumult and violence. A few original cemeteries remain, but the extant monuments and remnants of monuments have been recovered only after desecration. In Chen Dasheng's famous study, 149 tombstones were examined, originating from the Renfeng Gate and Tonghuai Gate cemeteries, from the walls and burial plot of the Ashab Mosque, and from unknown original contexts. Inscriptions range from Persian to Arabic in multiple calligraphic styles, but the majority describe Muslims of Persian origin. Chen records inscriptions for individuals hailing from Bukhara, Gilan, Hamadan, Isfahan, Jarjoram, Khorazm, Khorasan, Siraf, Shiraz, and Tabriz, with some describing multi-generational presence for Persian families living in Chuanzhou. There is evidence indicating that Chuanzhou's Islamic tombstones were not just used locally, but exported for other Muslim merchant communities abroad. The area surrounding Chuanzhou possessed the raw materials necessary for the stone industry and the demonstrated expertise for stone cutting and carving. Multiple Muslim tombstones excavated in Brunei are thought to have been manufactured and shipped out from Chuanzhou. Lamburn has described networks of Islamic tombstone distribution around the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, linking Fujian in southern China to Brunei, the Philippines, and Sumatra, starting in the 13th century. Interestingly, the best known example of a style of Islamic tombstones, often produced for export in the Indian port city of Khambat, was for a merchant buried there in the 14th century, known by the Nisba of Kazaruni. Pearson, Lee, and Lee describe a particular Persian gravestone in Chuanzhou as an example of acculturation. Known as the gravestone of Ahmed, it is inscribed in Persian, Arabic, and Chinese, and narrates a Chuanzhou family story of multiple generations, including intermarriage with a local woman and mastery of the Chinese language. Intermarriage with elite Chinese women was an effective way to enhance social networks, security, and access to power. Hung writes that through marital strategy, foreign merchants attempted to establish linkages with key groups within the local Chinese community. But the Song court banned intermarriage between foreigners and members of the imperial clan unless very rigid criteria could be met. The foreigner in question would have to prove their family's presence in China for at least 3 previous generations and demonstrate the existence of one official in their line. Regulations such as this made elite marriages very hard to come by and reified the power of foreign families already in possession of significant roots in China. And finally, the Tufan were locally born children of foreigners whose families immigrated to China during the Tang-Song transition and whose families controlled the international maritime trade. In the early 12th century, this group of families appealed to the Song court to grant their Chinese-born generations the right to trade domestically. This transition more deeply entrenched particular family lines within the Chinese economy and privileged them in the administration of affairs in the Fanfang. Many other families persisted in non-elite intermarriage, giving rise to the majority of the Chuanzhou Hui community. Religion here played a significant role in the reconstitution of family relationships and set the Muslim community apart from their non-Muslim Chinese relatives. For Hui in contemporary Chuanzhou, their maritime Muslim roots remain important regardless of current religious identity. The Muslim diaspora in southern China maintained a distinct community identity that persisted over generations, across dynastic change, and in the face of outbursts of profound hostility toward their presence. It is telling that one of the most enduring sources of evidence of their persistence is the archive of their desecrated tombstones. Gravestones have been hidden in the walls and buried in the grounds of the Ashab Mosque, including one narrating the escape from Iran by the son of a government minister assassinated in 1312. This refugee was given passage by merchants and made a new life for himself in Chuanzhou, undoubtedly with the help of those merchants, where his memory was protected from turmoil within the walls of the community's memory. The relationships constructed from religious brotherhood and marriages on the southern shore provided an essential form of kinship for Muslim immigrants to China. This home built in relationships during the Tang, Song, and Yuan periods was the shelter and infrastructure of the Muslim merchant community on the coast. Thank you.
abundance of wine and strong drinks, spiced wine, honey wine, new wine, mead, mulberry wine, and all that can intoxicate. To the degree that beer, which is generally excellent in England, and particularly in Kent, had no place among the others. For beer there mixed with goblets would be like herbs among the other dishes. You might see such extreme excess and extravagance of both food and drink that would not only cause distaste in the one consuming it, but even weariness in the person seeing it. What would Paul the Hermit say to this? What Antony, what Benedict, the father and founder of the monastic life? So what do we do with this? Sometimes people take this as the image of what monks were getting up to in 12th century monasteries. It's clearly exaggerated. At Bury, at Sampson is probably has 3 or 4 dishes brought into him. And Bury is comparably wealthy and comparably large. And that may be more typical than when they're young. So, but I think, it was fun and people enjoyed it. And I think we want to hang on to that, and we don't want to be too quick to assume the censoriousness with which Gerald is telling this story. There are lots of elements I think we can talk about in this story. Some of these elements are not typical. Some of them are typical. All of them are Gerald's. So let's start thinking about it in that way. And those 3 things: what's not typical, what's typical, and what's Gerald. So I can have the next slide. So what's not typical? Well, we want to begin with the place. Christ Church Priory. Now I'm cheating because, of course, Christ Church is the dedication of Canterbury Cathedral, but the priory is actually dedicated to the Trinity. And due to an oddity of English ecclesiastical organization, many of the cathedrals are supported not by chapters of secular canons, but by priories, and Canterbury is one of them. So Canterbury includes all the dioceses, the province includes all the dioceses except for York and Durham. So it's really important, in other words. It's very wealthy. They probably own half of the town of Canterbury and a whole bunch of other property as well. In fact, they wrote an account of their properties that's known as the Doomsday Lancorum to keep track of it. Hard to know how many monks we're talking about. When they go into exile in 1207 under King John, there seem to be about 80. So we're probably looking at 80 to 100 monks, which is very, very large. Cluny's bigger. A lot of monasteries have 12 monks. The Cistercians, in fact, when they get to a certain size, are expected to hive off those extra monks, because too big is not good. We also tend to think of monasteries as being impermeable, sort of the ecclesiastical equivalent of village hotels. But in fact, in the nail houses, there's a tremendous amount of coming and going. So I want to talk about this diagram a little bit. But one of the things that we want to keep in mind here is, so here's a diagram of the monastic precinct from the 1150s. And look at all the gates, how many ways in there are. Visitors of all sorts coming out, monks go in and out too. Monastic property has to be managed. Some of that can be done by secular people, but most often have to go out and do it themselves. Monasteries have lots of guests, whether those guests are simple travelers or people doing diocese in business. And if I can have the next slide. So here are some of the things. You'll notice that there were like 3 areas for guests in the monastic precinct. And the guests are ranked. Really important guests go to a different place, and less important guests go. Some of the business obviously will be a diocesan business, but of course, in 1179, Canterbury has also become one of the most important pilgrimage sites in England. If you look at the size of their privy, so it's a huge building and there's a privy, it seats 53. They also have a moon house, as you'll see. Secular guests won't eat in the refectory, so the refectory would be where the monks eat, but male clerical guests would be able to eat there. So let's go back to the date. It's 1179. So Thomas Becket has been canonized in 1173. He's almost an instant saint. And there are all sorts of pilgrims who come to Canterbury because of that pilgrimage. A few months after Gerald has his meal there, Louis VII of France comes to Canterbury and he gifts the monks with 1,600 gallons of wine a year. Okay. And doesn't produce wine, at least not wine you really want to drink in this period. So they've also had a major fire and they're rebuilding the cathedral at this point, and all of this pilgrimage is helping to pay for that. Finally, it's not an ordinary day. Trinity Sunday is one of the most important feasts at Trinity Priory, as you might imagine. But it's important in another way too, which is it's the Sunday which comes after Pentecost. It's preceded by 3 Ember Days. So the Ember Days are days of fasting and prayer. You're only allowed to ordain people on 6 Saturdays in the year, and the Ember Saturdays are among them. So, in other words, there are people at this feast who have just been ordained, men who have just said their first Mass. That's a really big deal at any time. So, it's not an ordinary day. And we have to imagine that when the abbot is sending food down to particular individuals, it may be the individuals who were just ordained who are getting those special treats. So it's not a typical monastery, it's not a typical day, it's not a typical time. But there are things that are typical. For instance, the setting down of dishes we know is typical. And although Gerald doesn't call them pittances, they probably would have been called pittances in that period. There's a tremendous amount of food at these big monastic feasts, always, because the leftovers go to the poor. What's also typical is he doesn't mention any meaty, either meat or meaty dishes. So it's all fish. Meat eating does occur in monasteries, but they don't do it in the refectory. Meaty dishes, so these are dishes made with, say, broths or entrails, sometimes do, but he doesn't mention any of those. He mentions cheese and eggs. And there is a fish pond, as you can see, on the diagram. This, by the way, is the diagram of the waterworks. They had water under pressure, so some fabulous engineering went into this. But Canterbury is not terribly far from sources of water. It's on the river Stour. There are probably weirs to get fish. There are sea markets in various directions within 20 miles. So fish are typical. So is alcohol. Monks are allowed to have wine, according to the rule of St. Benedict. The priory has a brew house, an excellent brew house. I think we've moved on to what is typical here. Sorry, I'm not keeping track of these slides. Probably ordinarily the monks are drinking beer, and the brew house makes that possible. But they would sometimes have wine. There's an Anglo-Saxon sign list from Canterbury that mentions wine as well as beer, and wine is a really popular thing. So, it typically will be a sign. In the 12th century, by the way, this donations that are given for pittances are really a popular way for lay people to show piety, to look after the monks. And in many monasteries, there is an official whose job is to keep track of those pittances. One of the writers I worked on, William Roger, actually says that their cellarer in the 1140s erased names from the book of life of the monks, so he didn't have to give the monks pittances on those days. It's typical that they don't necessarily go to all monks. Some monks don't get any. You're not supposed to murmur. Murmuring is the monastic sin. You're not supposed to murmur if you don't get a pittance. Susanna Heisterbach actually tells a story about a woman who does not receive a pittance and she offers it up to God, and God gives her a sweet taste in her mouth that makes ordinary pittances seem totally pointless. But it's so again, these are really common. Sometimes it's a pittancer, but the cellarer usually is the person who hands them out. Not every monk will get to taste every dish. Cheese and eggs are also really popular. I won't say very much about sign in the interest of time. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But excessive sign is something that would be condemned and probably happened absolutely everywhere. The sign system was invented at Cluny, it spreads everywhere. I suspect there were local dialects, and there's certainly local vocabulary, and we don't necessarily know what that would be. A lot of it would be orally conveyed, particularly the things that young monks are not supposed to be talking about. So let's go on to Gerald. How am I doing? Yes, I'm doing fine. So Gerald is the archetypal problematic narrator in all of this. And his autobiography presents a lot of problems. And he's writing about 1179, but he's writing between 1208 and 1216, so many, many years later. He's in his 60s, and he's a man who's disappointed of all of the hopes that he might have harbored. He's the grandchild of a Welsh princess. He's closely related to the Fitzgerald family, the conquerors of Ireland. His uncle David is the Bishop of St. David's in Wales. And the highest office that he ever holds is Archdeacon of Brecon, which is one of the archdeaconries of Wales. His career stalled out for reasons that are not entirely clear. In his autobiography, he comes across as a person who's particularly rigid and harsh. He tries several times to be elected to St. David's and he fails. He never gets preferment from the Plantagenet kings and he turns against them. He says he was offered a bishopric in Ireland and he turned it down, and I believe that he probably thought it was beneath him. He does tell us that he was even among the better people at the high table. And so my sense is that this is a guy who is so convinced of his own qualities. And I have to say, as I read about and think about 12th century ecclesiastical figures and scholars, academic life just comes back and bites me so. He's so convinced of his qualities that he doesn't, and he has enormous qualities. There's no question he's a brilliant writer. He has those connections. He tells us in his autobiography that he's really extraordinarily good looking. And he thinks he doesn't have to pay dues. This is not a court in which you get anywhere without paying dues, no matter who you are. Geoffrey Riddell, who is the chancellor for Henry II, is willing to be excommunicated for him. Stephen of Fougere, who I worked on fairly recently, puts in a decade as a clerk riding around behind the king before he gets some pretty plum appointments. Nobody gets by on charm in this court. So these are the works of his old age. Now, I am not suggesting that old Gerald disapproves of things that young Gerald enjoyed. I don't think that's necessarily true. But I think that framing has to be part of this. The works that he's writing in his old age are about ecclesiastical order and moral order. They're also apologetic. They're intended to show him in the best possible light and show how his conduct was always appropriate. The writers of slightly earlier periods, Stephen of Fougere, John of Salisbury, Walter Map, all talk about how difficult and envious this court is, and I get a whiff of that energy when I read what Gerald has written. So conclusions, we need to not take what he has to say as emblematic of the whole of monastic experience. We need to be careful, I think, not to accept the moral frameworks that come embedded in these narratives about monastic practice. The world about the monks changes enormously between the time of Saint Benedict in the 6th century and Gerald's time, in time and in space. Just to give one example, Benedict comes from a world in which the day and the night are not that different in length in the winter and the summer. This is not true in England. Benedict would not have imagined that a priory would be a completely chapter. That's not how he's thinking about monks. But I think we can take from it a sense that while the virtuosos are going to fast, and indeed we know men and women who fast nearly to death, and sometimes to death, ordinary monks might agree with Beckett, as his biographer Herbert of Blossom reports, and this is a story that Gerald knew because he quotes it. And he's writing about Beckett a few days before his death at Christmas. He's writing back about Christmas, which is a few days before his death. At the secular table, he displayed his usual good spirits, eating meat as on other days, even though it was Friday and Christmas Day, pronouncing that on such day, it was more religious to feast than to fast. I suspect that the monks of Trinity Priory felt that Trinity Sunday was indeed a day to feast rather than fast. Thank you.
So much. So I'm going to hand things off to our final speaker for today. That's Katie Jasper from Illinois State University, who will be speaking to us on coming together to live alone, solitude and sociability in medieval hermit communities.
All right. Well, that's a tough act to follow. That was a wonderful presentation. I'd like to say thank you to Peter and Nathan and to the entire university for hosting us. I'm going to talk about something related to monasticism, which is hermetism. And I have to say that no one knows what hermetism is, or no one did until 2020, when suddenly people were saying, we're all hermits. We should think about this. There weren't any news outlets really saying that we should turn to ancient hermits for tips to survive lockdown, but that's kind of where I went. So there is a lot of, well, as we all know, psychological stress associated with isolation. And so I thought, as we were going through lockdown, I'm relevant. I'm relevant because I know a secret about hermits that most medievalists know, which is that hermits have always been, in fact, very social. So for everyone who argued that we should resist the temptation to socialize and to embrace being alone, well, solitude has proved our perennial problem, and it probably always will be. Human beings are social creatures. Different from the norm, therefore, usually means seeking separation. But in the modern pandemic, separation became the norm. And yet, as involuntary hermits, we manage to find ways to socialize with one another. And it shouldn't surprise us that we need to be around others. Indeed, I will argue today that even self-declared medieval hermits rarely achieved constant and complete isolation by design. During the Middle Ages, from Egypt, Assyria to Gaul, Britain, all across the Western world and even into the East, men as well as women sought to exist in literal and figurative deserts, and they often did so collectively in communities. The practice then declined in popularity but experienced a revival in 11th century Italy when devout Christians came together to live alone. The word hermit conjures up images of long beards, disheveled clothes, and I always like to tell my students, just think of John the Baptist, every image of John the Baptist, that disheveled hair. So the idea of a hermit community might seem paradoxical today, but it was widespread. It was a widespread phenomenon across the medieval West around the first millennium. So like monks and nuns, hermits retreat from society and sociability. The performance of renouncing the world creates the terms on which they socialize with each other and with the outside. But unlike monasteries, hermitages were not closed off from the outside world by walls. Hermits renounced all previous sociability by cutting ties with the outside world, but material conditions at the hermitage guaranteed that sociability remained open to its residents. So in this presentation, I'm going to address two questions, which are put up there to sort of guide me. First, in what ways did medieval hermits create conditions for a certain type of sociability? And second, how did transgressions of this sociability affect their status? And I think given the recent pandemic turning us into temporary hermits, it's worth considering the ways in which our predecessors struck a healthy balance between sociability and solitude. But how to identify hermits? What counts as hermiting? For the sake of clarity, I rely on loosely defined criteria. Hermits are people who live in relative isolation outside the boundaries of a monastic property or church as part of their ascetic practice. Absolute solitude and truly wild wilderness functioned more as idealized aspects of asceticism. And we could explore these questions in numerous contexts, but today I will focus on the wave of hermetism during the 10th and 11th centuries, what renowned medievalist Jacques Lecoeur called Benedictine Hermetism, and which Henrietta Leiser then later christened the New Hermetism. The New Hermetism manifested in various forms across Western Europe. It focused on poverty and simplicity and on the care of souls. Its practitioners often implicitly or even explicitly criticized monastic life. At the same time, it redefined the frontier between monasticism and hermetism. Many hermits lived in individual cells, but regrouped in a community and adopted a rule. They shared a desire for the solitude and quiet of an imagined wilderness. So given the range of possible experiences in the wilderness, expressions of the New Hermetism varied. Western monasticism reinterpreted flight to the desert metaphorically as an inner journey of the mind taking place in the cloister or cell, where the real work of becoming closer to God began. Hermits often lived in cells around a central structure, like a church or monastery. And this setting apparently encouraged friendships. So at this point, I'm going to spend some time narrating about a particular hermit named Saint Romuald. Certainly a handsome man. So Saint Romuald is known today as the founder of the Comal Balaise order. But he has a really exciting life story. Before he converted to monasticism, he was a wealthy noble son, and he would, as a noble man, he would spend time in the forest hunting. And as he was wandering through the forest, his biographer tells us that his soul longed for quiet solitude. And he once marveled at a wooded glen and said, quote, "Oh, how well hermits could dwell in the recesses of these woodland groves," which is not what typical nobles on hunts say. His life then follows a really formulaic narrative that begins with rejecting his wealth and nobility in a moment of crisis, and then converting to monastic life at Santa Polinare in Ravenna. So he stayed at the monastery and then decides he's too spiritually good for the monastery. And he then leaves. And I think his brethren were pretty happy that he did. And he went to go live by himself in a cell outside of the city of Venice, which was his desert. And he went there because there was another hermit living there named Marinus. And apparently with Marinus, Romuald found his yearning for solitude fulfilled. So when Romuald met Marinus, the older man had already been living as a hermit for some time, and he observed his own idiosyncratic practices. So he'd sort of wander around the site and just kind of sing the psalms. And Romuald's Vita, his life story, describes the hermit as simple, uneducated, and that he became a hermit without any formal instruction. But Romuald respected him as his teacher and as his friend. So they would sing the psalms together, they prayed together, they ate together, they fasted together, day in and day out. Around 978, Marinus and Romuald were joined by a third convert, and it was the Doge of Venice, no less. So Peter Orsono, which is basically like one of the most powerful leaders in the West, just shows up at their hermitage and says, I'd like to join because I feel a little guilty for having murdered my predecessor. And so he sought the advice of Marinus and Romuald, and they said, come join our club and we'll work towards repentance. And then Peter brought a friend of his named Guarinius, who's also a monk, and he was a little prone to wander. That's what the Vita says, that he was kind of a wandering monk. And then the band decides that they're going to travel to Guarinius Monastery, which is in Gaul. It's sort of on the border between Spain and Gaul and the Pyrenees. And then Peter brings another one of his friends who had conspired with him in the murder. So I think he was also seeking repentance. And so we have Peter, John, Romuald, and Marinus and Guarinius all traveling by ship from Venice to the monastery of San Miguel in Cuba, which is in the Pyrenees, as I said. And Peter and John decide to become monks. But Romuald and Marinus distance themselves from the monastery, and they continue being hermits sort of on the outskirts. In less than a year, though, Peter and John had joined them, sort of graduated to hermetism. Then Romuald was compelled to leave San Miguel because news reached him that his father, Servius, had decided to become a monk, but then had backed out. And so in this moment of crisis, Romuald returned to Italy and then cured his father. And he must have impressed the locals at the time because they very nearly murdered him to prevent the saint from leaving, claiming they could not bear his absence and would have preferred to possess his dead body rather than have allowed him to leave. So the point here is that whenever Romuald actually achieved solitude, he was never really alone. And whenever he retreated to his cell, he was interrupted. I could give you countless examples, but the general conclusion of his biographer, Peter Damian, is, quote, men flocked to him to seek penance, to give alms to the poor, and others left the world altogether and fervently hastened to adopt the monastic life. The most blessed Romuald was like a seraphim, a fire in the most remarkable way, with divine love, and wherever he went, he set others alight with the fire of his preaching. And he continued, for I have no doubt that the explanation behind all these moves was simply that a crowd of men, far too big to count, was always running after the holy man wherever he went. Reason demanded, therefore, that whenever he saw that any one place had become full to the brim with inhabitants, he would appoint a prior to hurry off to find somewhere else to colonize. So in sum, he would hand off this group of men to someone and then run away. So in this remark, the author is juxtaposing the rejection of sociability with the creation of new communities. And moreover, the very thing that rendered Romuald holy, solitude, was precisely what his followers constantly subverted. Lest we understand Romuald as an involuntary celebrity, let's keep in mind that he attracted these crowds through fiery public preaching. Romuald's fame attracted the attention of notable contemporaries too. And he managed to intermingle with elites while simultaneously embracing humility. So once, while he was near Ravenna, the Emperor of Germany, Otto III, met with him in a hermit's cell. And it's a really funny passage about his life because Otto realizes that Romuald would prefer not to cross into the profane space of the palace. And so he says, I will meet you in your hut. And when he comes to the hut, Romuald offers him a space next to him on his bed. And the emperor says, that blanket looks a little scratchy, I'm gonna pass. And so he did meet with the emperor eventually in his palace on another occasion. And Romuald also met with the subsequent emperor, Henry II, when he was in Italy in 1021. So he would often refuse these visits initially, but then his disciples would plead with him for whatever reason. And in the case of Henry II, his disciples were saying, please meet with the emperor because the monastery has become so overcrowded, and he could really give us a nice endowment if you make friends with him. Okay, so his sociability, it's not unique. He spent most of his life not in isolation, but surrounded by people. He traveled constantly, even taking ships to traverse long distances, and he traveled with people or to visit people. And now I'm going to give you just a few other examples to show that Romuald is not the only case of a traveling social hermit. If we go over the Alps, Romuald's contemporary, there's a hermit named Gunther, who had a similar experience. He also descended from nobility, and in 1006, at the age of 50, he renounced his inheritance and entered the Bavarian monastery at Niederaltaich. But he, like Romuald, found this unsatisfying. So 2 years later, in 1008, he became a hermit in the forests of Bavaria, near the Bohemian border. And then a small community following the Benedictine rule grew up around his cell in the valley, where he lived for 37 years as a simple brother. But he didn't spend all his time there. He traveled extensively on pilgrimages, and he never entirely withdrew from the world. In fact, word of Gunther's piety even reached King Stephen of Hungary, who invited Gunther to his court. And the old hermit died in Bohemia while visiting Duke Bretislav I. So for Romuald, as for Gunther, solitude hardly assumed a literal meaning. Paradoxically, community and pastoral care emerged as the fundamental features of hermetic solitude. Robert of Ottersell provides another example. Robert was born in Brittany. He died in 1116. He became an archdeacon early in his career, but then he ran off to wander in the desert. And by that, he meant the forests in 1095 in Gaul. And his Vita says that he lived among beasts until his piety attracted followers and he established a community. So does this sound familiar? But he continued to wander and even began preaching. And in one text, Marbona Bren remarked that Robert's sermons drew crowds of undesirables. And what he meant was prostitutes. So he's wandering around with a band of former prostitutes, and I can see how that might have caused a stir. Robert eventually settled down with a group of hermits in a deserted place that one day became the monastery of, let's see, oh, I had some more. I got distracted. That one day became the monastery of Fontevraud, which is where the Plantagenet kings and queens ended up being laid to rest. Okay, so apostolic hermit preachers, they seem to be everywhere. If we move a little bit to the north from where Robert was, we can see that there are a few hermits like Ramirius of Douai and also Altfried of Batten, who's both are preaching, both are speaking out against clerical abuses. They clearly have some sort of connection to Gregorian reform, and they end up founding communities, each of them. And in fact, Altfried ends up working with the Pope himself to make his region a center of monastic reform. If we move even farther north into England, monastic restoration in the north of England owed much to the new hermits and to their ambitious patrons as well. So around 1074, the prior of Wincombe Abbey, whose name is Aldwyn, enamored with the earlier monastic models described in Bede's ecclesiastical history, settled within the ruins of his former monastery at Wearmouth and Jarrow, but he was not alone for long. And later he traveled with two more monks, Alfwe and Brynfrid, and they visited York and then Newcastle, and then they obtained permission from the Bishop of Durham to live at Jarrow. And then Brynfrid left because every hermit has his limits, and the community became too crowded for him in 1077. And so he went to an even more deserted monastery at Whitby. But then people came, attracted to his piety, and his community became a monastic one, even though it originated as a hermit's retreat. The relationships among ascetics east and west attest to the influence and mobility of the new hermits, whose biographies emphasize friendships. On the frontiers of Christian Europe, the renunciation associated with the eremitic life and the hermit's humility and poverty complemented an idea of missionary brotherhood, in which the hermits kept these observances in common. And Hungary and Poland especially had large pagan populations inside and outside their borders, and missionaries wanted to remedy this. The result was a unique hermetic life that included dedication to Christian mission. And what you see here is a manuscript from one of the most famous lives of these missionary hermits who unfortunately didn't make it in their confrontation with pagans. But that's a story for another day. Pilgrims to the Holy Land also would have encountered Eastern hermit communities, which admittedly, that must sound like an oxymoron to many of you in hermit community. When they visited St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai or San Saba on the West Bank east of Bethlehem, few women enjoyed the freedom of hermetic wandering. Because as we all know, if you let women wander, they'll just get into trouble. But we can detect the presence of female solitaries in the historical record of the 11th century. So in my own research, I have uncovered one example. I have a document dating to 1059 in which 4 members of a seigneurial clan occupying a region in northeastern Italy promised to free the areas immediately around a particular hermitage of tenants, and it specifically mentions women. Furthermore, the men promised that no person, great or small, would be granted license to construct a dwelling in that area in which women would live. This case shows women lingering on the fringes of religious life, not necessarily nuns nor anchorites or recluses, but defying categorization altogether. Who might these women have been, and why did the brothers take such great pains to keep them at a distance? Perhaps their mobility threatened possible intrusion and transgression into the hermit space. So in sum, if the archetypal hermit image as a solitary was hardly ever true, what did solitude really mean in a medieval context? Early medieval hermetism was connected to the hermetic revival of the High Middle Ages through the shared examples of the Desert Fathers and early Western hermits. Another source of inspiration was so-called Benedictine hermetism mentioned in the first chapter of Benedict's Rule, where anchorites who, quote, after a long probation in the monastery, having learned by the help of many brethren how to fight against the devil, go out well armed from the ranks of the community to the solitary combat of the desert, to fight single-handed against the vices of the flesh and their own evil thoughts. Yet hermits like Romuald were often only temporarily in the desert, not committing themselves to a life of solitude. The authors of these vitae made no attempt to justify, rationalize, or excuse the mobility of hermits and their regular social contact. On the contrary, the biographies praise the evangelical activities of hermits. We assume that a hermit retreats from society and sociability. But the performance of renunciation creates the terms on which they socialize, with each other and with the outside. By renouncing the world and ideological power, they transcended conventional social boundaries. The temporal world in which hermits chose to dwell and to move, and the material comforts they chose to reject, created a matrix in which hermits communicated their sociability and simultaneously secured their status as holy men. So based on these accounts, the hermitage was not the rejection of sociability in general, but of institutionalized forms of sociability. Rommel's interactions with kings especially speaks to this issue. Hermits never renounced ideological power, but rather the organizations that wielded ideological power by virtue of their history and status. In light of these observations, it would be more appropriate to say that hermits rejected society, but not sociability. And perhaps that idea resonates today. I know, speaking for myself and some of my friends, we missed our friends and family over the course of the pandemic, but at the same time, I didn't mind much not leaving the house. Thank you.
So much for our speakers. We're gonna switch over to Q&A right now. We're gonna stay really well on time, so I was hardly even muted. We do ask that if you are asking a question, that you please use the microphone. I know plenty of you are capable of being loud, but it's an accessibility issue, and it's for the folks who are online. So Professor Eaton here has a mic, so if anybody wants to speak, come on down, or he'll bring it to you.
Turn it on.
Hello. It's very loud. Good evening, everyone. I've got 3 questions about the hermits topic. The first question is, how did they survive and interact with the external environment when it comes to trade, agriculture, food? How did they survive all this period of time? This second question is that, were there any specific factors and criteria based on which they used, based on which they chose where to live? And the third question is that, were they in multiple places or just a bunch of limited number, grouping themselves in certain place? Thank you. All right, I'll try again for the lecture. It was very beneficial.
Well, thank you. Those are wonderful questions. They're actually questions that I've been trying to answer for a long time. How do they survive? The simple answer is through patronage. So their extreme piety attracts donations, charitable donations.
mental health or whatever. But it, you know, give me an aspect of it.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. So I just read the question typed out. The question says, are there interior connections as you showed with the C ones? Can you clarify maybe, do you mean, maybe if you could clarify what you're asking, is this question for me? I couldn't hear any of the presentations, so I think this might be, you're asking about connections between my presentation and the other ones, is that right? So I apologize that I can't hear anything happening in the room. So the question reads, are there interior connections as you showed with the C ones, with the Jesuits? And I'm really unclear on, I wish I could hear you. Do the trade connections go into the interior? Yes, absolutely. So the land routes in this period are robust. So we're all familiar with the Silk Road and the kind of terminology around the Silk Road, but we know that those trade routes extended throughout Afro-Eurasia. And so the maritime routes were equally robust. And so what I was focusing on was the sort of maritime aspect of that, but 100%. The commodities, for the most part, are moving from inland areas to port communities and then traveling by sea. So some commodities are easier to move by sea than by land, but the trade connections absolutely you see by sea and by land. In terms of the kind of religious brotherhoods, there's also a relationship there. Sometimes you'll see different organizations that are more prominent along different trade routes, but definitely, I hope that answers your question. Okay, great.
China, an open empire, written by Valeria Hansen at Yale University. Professor. I have been struggling with the notion of China as an open empire during medieval time. Indeed, in many ways, China was an open empire. China received immigrants from all over, from Middle East, from Central Asia, from Europe, from many other Asian countries as well. Now, do you think, from your presentation, I can see that, yeah, a lot of Muslim building from Zhou, Changzhou, and many other coastal cities, that seems to confirm the validity of the theory China was open empire. Do you think China was open empire? And how open was it? And in particular, can you further explain the sociability between Muslim community and the Chinese people around the coastal area? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the question I've received reads, China in the Open Empire, a book that was read by the questioner. Do you think China was an empire at this time, and how open do you think it was? Is that the question? Was it an open empire? So during so in my talk, I cover the Tang Dynasty, the Song, and kind of allude to the Yuan. So yes, I think in the Tang Dynasty, there was an enormous amount of long distance trade going in and out of China. You see a kind of breakdown of the maritime aspect of that out of the port of Guangzhou in the later part of the Tang Dynasty. But then it rebuilds and just moves up the coast to Quanzhou and to other ports in Southeast Asia. We know that the maritime trade was, very robust and open during the Song period and also into the Yuan. So does that address what you were asking? I apologize that I can't hear what anyone is saying. Okay, so what you've written here is, yes, what was the larger relationship between the Chinese and the migrant Muslim community? So we're talking about, over a period of several centuries, right? So it changes. I think that because the luxury goods and prestige items, and even you could argue kind of staples in some sense that are coming into Chinese ports from abroad are, the Chinese communities are really reliant on foreign merchants for those materials, particularly during the Tang and part of the Song. And so there was a relationship of interdependence. These are merchants and communities that need each other. I think that there are sort of punctuated episodes of violence when there was a lot of political instability in China. It would sort of overflow onto the foreign merchants in port cities. But it's a very long-standing relationship. Muslims, Islam came to China by sea first in the 7th century, and Muslims have been there ever since.
We've got time for one or two more. And actually, she should not apologize at all for the technical glitch. I tested it all this morning and it worked perfectly well. I do apologize. But any more questions?
I have a question for Leah about having 3 sections of guests in the Feast of Christian Church. So was that for the purpose of because Christianity is based on the act of always serving, or what was that for? Why was this section dominated in that place?
Well, they're segregated by rank. So this is a highly socially stratified society. But part of what's going on, so this plan was a major revision of the monastic precinct, so the area in the wall. It was done in the 1150s, so well before Gerald's And even then, they had the need to expand their guest quarters. So monasteries often act as, so it's like those hotels that are set up by the Sufi brothers. Monastic hospitals. So, you know, the term hospital has hospitality in it, hospice, yes. Often serve as inns, as places for people to stay. Because Canterbury is the Archbishop of Canterbury is primate, so Canterbury is the major province under which all of the other dioceses operate. People are always coming in line there. So they have a huge number of guests. There are actually 4 areas for guests, but the 4th one isn't marked off because it's for servants. And I was really struck by the whole issue of servants because they don't come up often in the narratives until they do. But they are there. So that's really it. And part of it is one of those guest houses. So there's the hospital, which is an original guest house. There is the Aula Nova, the new hall, which is a relatively new building. And then there's the Camera Nova, the new chamber. So what we're seeing is accretion. The existing facilities and they can't handle all the guests that they've got, and they're continually creating new ones. The Camera Nova is the one that the really important people will stay in. It's close to the privy, so you don't have in the middle of the cold of the night, you're not wandering too far. And it's also close to the bathhouse. So all of the amenities are there. And it probably, on the diagram, it doesn't mark that it has its own kitchen, but it probably did. The hospital has its own kitchen, the infirmary has its own kitchen as well. So food is also being prepared in a lot of different places to feed those guests. Many of them, for one reason or another, will not be allowed to eat in the refectory. Female guests will not be allowed to eat in the refectory. Or laymen will not be allowed to eat in the refectory, so they have to have a place to feed them. Thank you.
I have one final question from our resident here, historian. As we all think about heading to speciation after the end of the conference this evening, what kind of beer was brewed at the Canada?
Important question.
Oh, well, you know, medieval beer is kind of like alcoholic porridge, they're not, they don't have finance or any of the other things which make beer clear. And they don't have hops, which are a new world plant. So, so I think if you think of very, very thin oatmeal with some alcohol in it, it's food actually. And the food historians can stress that we should not actually treat medieval beer as a drink so much as a food. Still, there was 1,600 gallons of wine coming in here. Some of that's going to get drunk by the wine. So, I mean, obviously, with 100 months, I imagine most of them are priests at this stage, and so you need wine for the daily masses that each of those priests will say, or maybe even multiples in a given day. And that's 1,600 gallons, and you need some for the really important guests as well. I bet you there's sweet a bunch of wine. Wine is actually highly prized as it is. And on the other side of the channel, at the monastery of Andra, which I guess works on, one of the countesses leaves the monks at Andra. This is a much smaller monastery, 12 to 20 monks, something like that. Some of the best wine, he specifies the best wine to be used as pittances. And he's grumbling actually because for Aristotle actually he gets it.
would have been bog myrtle, right? Because they would have had hospital in the 14th century in England, right?
I have no idea. You need to talk to somebody who really knows something about
Yeah, I think hops from in the 14th century, they would have brewed at least until the late 13th, they would have certainly used bog myrtle, right, in England. Bog myrtle beer, it's great, I drank some last year. Yeah, you can order it, special, yeah.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a beer special.
I just happened to read this article on it last year.
Well, I stand informed.
I don't know, I just happened to come across it as, I thought we'd have this conference last year, so I read about bog myrtle beer. I know you're down, so I've been waiting a year to be able to say.
So are we having it tonight?
No.
Maybe.
All right, well, on that note, that will wrap up our medieval session and our first day of the Great Lakes History Conference. Thanks once again to our great panelists. We will be heading to speciation. They're expecting us between 6 and 6:30. We have spots reserved there. If you do need assistance getting there, we can help arrange rides for you. So just ask one of the GVSU faculty and we'll help you out. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
That's good.
Well, we gotta walk back to the hotel.
Hi.
Hi.
I am Julia and I am presenting tomorrow and I have my file on this one. I download it now or should I download it tomorrow because it takes a while to load and then it gets period. I'm in the lab towards the lab.
I think the easiest way to do it is I can trust these computers.
Okay.
I think there's.
Okay, so let me get your. So you're off to medical school?
We'll see you there.
We'll do.
Perfect. Okay, here's my presentation. Okay. Yeah, definitely, because if I know that going into Dropbox, I have to do all these passwords. Okay, and there are only 2 panelists in mine, so how long are we supposed to go?
Then it's up to you. If you would like to go with your plan for it.
Okay.
We'll go a little bit longer. Have a little more conversation.
Okay.
We're not gonna shepherd for 2 hours.
Okay,
So, yeah.
all right, I'm trying to keep it limited.
Yeah.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
Another salmonella class facility, but it doesn't present in the same way as regular typhoid.
Okay.
Smallpox